again, everybody. I'm Rusty, aka William Robinson, aka Dr. Robinson, and I am the Blues Doctor. Welcome to my podcast. It's called The Blues Doctor Recommends, and we're glad to see you today. We are back in the doctor's office here in Orange Beach, Alabama. It's cooled off a little bit. We're starting to feel fall here finally in South Alabama, and we're feeling good. So, please remember to like and subscribe, ring the bell, share, make comments, and all of those things, and we'll get to it. There really wasn't anything in the music calendar that I could find that I thought was appropriate to share with you all this week. So I finally gave up and started looking elsewhere. Now, I know some of you all are going to think of something, some event in music that I should have shared. And if you do, please add that to the comments. But I just gave up on that for this week. And I started to think, well, what else outside of music is in the calendar? And I came up with this. On this past Wednesday, October 1st, 2025, was Yom Kippur. For those of you who don't know, Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year for Judaism. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I actually went to an all-boys Catholic high school run by the Christian Brothers, and it was about two-thirds Catholic. About two-thirds of the kids were Catholic. The other third were about evenly split between Protestant and Jewish kids. And the brothers felt it was important that we all had to learn about each other's religions, so we had to study the Jewish high holy days. So I learned a fair amount about Yom Kippur, and I've kind of kept up with that over the years. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Yom Kippur occurs annually on the 10th of Tishrei, and that's spelled Tishrei, and that is corresponding to a date in either late September or early October in our regular calendar. It's referred to as the Day of Atonement and of repentance, reflection, confession, and seeking forgiveness from God and others. The day's main observances include fasting, usually at the temple, abstaining from physical comforts, attending extended prayer services, usually at the synagogue, and reciting confessional prayers. The laws of Yom Kippur were determined by Moses in the Torah, or what we would know as the Old Testament. And there's several places in the Old Testament or the Torah where you can find references to Yom Kippur. And we're going to talk about a few because I think those are important. The first one is Leviticus 16, 1 through 34. I didn't describe that passage in the first recording too well, so we're going to try again. This will be Leviticus one more time. Basically, the Lord is telling Moses how Aaron should approach the most holy place, and that is he has to have this elaborate ritual including sacrifices such as a bull and two goats, one of which becomes the so-called scapegoat. That's where that term came from. And it's basically a description of what Aaron has to do to begin his atonement. So that's where the concept of Yom Kippur basically was first noted. The next one was also in Leviticus, this time Leviticus 23, 26 through 32. And basically this one said the 10th day of Tishrei, that special month, is a holy day of atonement. A temple sacrifice must be offered while the people must fast and not work on the 9th day from evening until evening. And then finally, a third reference was in Numbers. So as you can tell, these references are all in the books of Moses. Numbers 29, 7 through 11. The 10th day of Tishrei is a holy one. One must fast and not work. Yom Kippur is also mentioned briefly in some other contexts. Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, the shofar was to be blown. The shofar is the special horn mentioned again in the Torah that was used for holy purposes. According to some, this was the source for the custom of blowing the shofar at the conclusion of Yom Kippur currently. The origins of Yom Kippur are unclear. Some say it started with the Israelites in the desert under Moses. Others say that it really was introduced much later, maybe even as late as the Babylonian exile, because there are some Babylonian elements present in it. suggesting that it might not have been until then. So that would have been several hundred years later. However, whenever it happened, Yom Kippur is very serious for Jews. So keep that in mind for next year when we're approaching Yom Kippur and give it the appropriate respect, maybe even mention it to some of your Jewish friends, and they'll probably be very receptive to it and be willing to tell you all about it. You might learn something. We're going to move on to the medicine segment now. And you may recall, if you've been with us the past 2 weeks, that we've taken a deep dive into what I have called Medicine versus MAGA 2025. And 2 weeks ago, we actually looked at some of the causes of that conflict between medicine and science and what some people would call MAGA populism. Then last week, we looked at some possible solutions to some of those problems. Since then, I've gotten several specific questions from you all about various aspects of that, including one, and in fact, I'll kind of summarize. I get this from several people. How do the pharmaceutical companies get their drugs to market? And I realized that I kind of glossed over that part when I was talking last week. So I'll go into some detail here about that today. The process by which new drugs get approved as medicine in the United States is complex, and it revolves around the process we refer to as clinical research. Now, that's in contrast to basic science research, which means developing a new agent, whatever kind of agent that may be, in the laboratory. And I'm going to skip over that part. That'll be a whole nother talk unto itself. We'll move to the point where the agent has been created, where it's ready to take forward and use in humans. So here's how it works. First, you have to get a new drug patented, and the owner of the drug, creator of the drug, gets it patented for the purpose of determining who owns it going forward. It's a way of documenting by the government who is legally responsible for it and who potentially could get paid for the rights of it. It's relatively easy to get a patent for a new agent. Basically, you just go and pay your money and do some paperwork, and they'll tell you, okay, now you own this agent, whatever it may be. The rest of it is much more complex. The first step after getting your patent typically is something we call a phase one trial. And this kind of a trial is relatively small. It's typically 20 patients, maybe even less, that it involves. And it's really the first human use of your agent potentially. So it's primarily designed to monitor toxicity in your new agent. You administer it to patients who have failed standard therapy, for example. In cancer patients, that might be in women with recurrent metastatic cervical cancer who have already had radiation or surgery or chemotherapy or all three of those and really don't have many options left. Typically, their life expectancy is less than a year. So those patients are willing to take more of a risk, basically, and try a drug that hasn't been proven. That's kind of how we define a phase one clinical trial. We follow those patients after they receive the agent for mostly toxicity or side effects. What we also may do in the context of a phase one trial is look at dose escalation. So, for example, in the first 5 patients, say, of the trial, we will administer the agent at a certain dose. If the patients tolerate that dose, then for the next 5 patients, we may go up to 2 times that dose. And then if those are tolerated, we may go up from there. In other words, you're trying to determine what the optimal dose is that's not unacceptably toxic. So that's clearly what I mean talking about a phase one trial. That's the first step in the process. Basically, if you pass, quote, a phase one trial, all it really means is that your agent does not have unacceptable toxicity. We do, in fact, look at response or efficacy, you might call it, of the new drug in a phase one setting, but that's kind of secondary. Certainly it would be exciting if you had patients who had failed all other treatments and one or more, several of them, started getting responses. But that's not really what we're looking for. You really can't comment too much on the efficacy of the drug in a phase 1 setting. So if you pass phase 1, if you have a successful or acceptable phase 1 trial, then you can move on to phase 2. Actually, let me back up a little bit and make a comment on toxicity. Typically, in a phase 1 trial, there's a very complex statistical plan that's built into the trial. And basically, it will say if you encounter this many, and it may be 3, it may be 4, it may be 5, serious toxicities. And what I mean by serious, they're potentially life threatening toxicities, then the trial will stop. In other words, we will not proceed with the trial even if everything else is okay. So that's built into the trial, or stopping points if X amount of toxicity occurs. Then, as I said, we move on to the so-called phase 2 trials. The phase 2 trials will involve more patients, typically 50 to 100, maybe even more. They typically involve patients who are earlier in their disease process. In other words, those who haven't yet been treated extensively. Maybe they've had one round of treatment in the form of chemotherapy, maybe nothing. Maybe they've just had surgery or something. At any rate, so it's patients who are more likely to get a response to treatment. And that's more what we're after, more what we're looking for in a phase 2 trial. In other words, we're starting to look at the efficacy of the agent, or the likelihood that the agent will be therapeutic for whatever disease you're studying. Now, we still, in fact, look at toxicity in a phase 2 trial. And again, phase 2 trials have statistical methods built into them to have certain stopping points. Like after, say, the first third of the patients are accrued, then you go back and look at those patients for toxicity. If there have been too many side effects, either that you didn't expect or side effects that were worse than you did expect, then it would likely have a stopping point built into it there. And it may do it again after 2/3 of the patients have been enrolled. And if you don't meet those stopping points, then it goes on to full accrual, which, like I said, may be 100 patients or more. Then what you look at is the response rate. And part of the statistical plan that involves response rate goes something like this. The estimated response rate of that group of patients to whatever the standard therapy might be is included in the statistical outcome. Now, as an example, that a patient who had invasive cervical cancer, for which they had a radical hysterectomy and pelvic lymph node dissection, we know in those patients that the risk of recurrence, if you don't do anything else, is about 20%. So if we wanted to design a trial to reduce that risk of recurrence, then we might add an agent onto the surgery. In other words, after surgery, you get this agent that's supposed to prevent recurrence, and it compares itself to what your projected or estimated recurrence risk is. So say again, if the estimated recurrence risk is around 20% with standard care, then if the recurrence rate in the with the study drug is, say, 15%, in other words, it's less likely to come back if you are using the study drug, then that agent is deemed acceptable for further testing. And again, like I say, you continue to use or to monitor toxicity as well. Then if your study drug has a successful, quote, successful phase 2 trial, then it can move on to the phase 3 setting. And again, let me back up a little bit and say that what that really means is that the study agent, the investigational agent, we sometimes call it, is deemed eligible to be evaluated at the phase 3 level by passing a phase 2 trial. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that your new agent, your study agent, is ready to go to market. Got it? Okay. So let's talk about phase 3 trials for a minute. These trials are typically much larger. They may include hundreds of patients, maybe 400 or 500, sometimes even in the thousands for very specific trials. And these subjects are typically very early in the disease process. In fact, it may be their first treatment, and they may have had no previous treatment. They're typically randomized, which means there are two different treatment arms, and each patient is randomly assigned to one of those arms. One treatment arm will be whatever the current or standard therapy is. The other arm might be, say, the current or standard therapy plus your new study agent. So again, for an example, let's consider newly diagnosed ovarian cancer. So most of those women will have had surgery to remove most or all of the visible disease. So they will be very nearly disease-free when they finish surgery. However, we know that those patients are likely to have their disease recur. In fact, the recurrence rate is something like 75 or 80%. The typical disease-free interval, or the time until the disease comes back from surgery, is around 24 months. So most patients with ovarian cancer who are treated with the current standard, and for many years that standard has been a combination of two drugs called carboplatin and paclitaxel or Taxol, that treatment is associated with a disease-free interval of about 2 years. In other words, 2 years where they feel pretty good and have no evidence of disease. Unfortunately, as I said, the disease comes back something like 80% of the time. So our goal in the context of a trial might be to lower that recurrence risk. So the study arm of the trial, your new agent, may be added to the current standard. So carboplatin, Taxol plus the investigational agent, all given just as you would to somebody or to any other patient, but minus the investigational agent. In other words, you want those two treatment arms to look as much alike as you possibly can so that the only variable between the two is whether they got the investigational agent or not. So then you follow those patients until the disease comes back, or if the disease comes back. And sometimes we call that time to progression, or the time until we see new evidence of disease. And as I said, say your current standard has a time to progression, and you're measuring this, of 24 months. Typically, you have, again, created a statistical formula that you build into the trial that suggests that this trial will be statistically significantly positive if the time to recurrence is pushed out to, say, 30 months or 6 additional months. Now, I'm not saying those are the absolute numbers, but that's the idea behind it. In other words, you would follow both groups of patients, you follow them on the same schedule, and then you compare the time to progression of each of those two groups and decide whether it's statistically significant or not. We always, as always, we still look for toxicity and collect any data on side effects that may occur, and again have stopping points built into the trial if too many side effects occur, even in the context of a phase 3 trial, and that sometimes does happen. I was reminded actually while we were taping this a few minutes ago that we did a trial one time on patients with a rare kind of brain cancer, and I'll never forget the principal investigator, the man who was in charge of the trial, came up to the podium at the meeting we were at and said, "Well, we gave 6 patients the new agent, and all 6 died within 6 months. So we closed the trial." That does happen sometimes unexpectedly. So we're looking at typically with a phase 3 trial, either time to progression or sometimes even overall survival, particularly if you have a very aggressive disease. It may be more reasonable to look at overall survival than time to progression. So if a phase 3 trial is positive, that means the study arm is proven to be statistically superior to the control arm. Then the owner of the agent may want to go to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, to ask for approval for that new agent in whatever context or whatever indication is the word we frequently use. So, with our ongoing example of ovarian cancer, we may ask, or the investigator may ask, to use study drug plus carboplatin paclitaxel in an adjuvant setting. Adjuvant meaning just in addition to traditional therapy, which may include the surgery, for example. The new agent may be considered adjuvant therapy. Maybe that can be our word for the week is adjuvant. We'll keep that in mind. At any rate, the FDA at that point can say one of three things. First off, they could simply approve the agent for that indication right off the bat. Okay, that would be a good thing for the investigator, right? Might be a good thing for the patients also. The second option is that they could disapprove the agent for whatever reason they want to, and they do so not infrequently. But actually, the most common answer the FDA gives is the third, and that is they can neither approve nor disapprove, but send the agent back for more data, more tests, more whatever. Sometimes they'll even ask for a full additional phase 3 trial for whatever reason. And that's not uncommon in the cancer world in particular, where our treatments are particularly harsh. So the FDA approval is not easily obtained. But once it is, then the owner can market that drug for that indication to the public, basically. And typically, marketing is a whole other thing in itself, and we're not going to talk about that at this point either. This is a very rough and very quick outline of the whole approval process and clinical research process, but I think you can already tell just from this how complex and time consuming it is. A typical drug in this scenario may take 10 years or more from being ready for phase 1, in other words, just out of the laboratory, to the point of being prescribed to patients. We've tried various ways to streamline that process or even come up with totally new ways to determine the efficacy and safety of a drug. But right now, and for the past 50 years or so, this has been the standard. I wouldn't be surprised if our standard changes, particularly in the era of new molecular therapies, where we may be able to target a specific therapy to a specific individual tumor rather than a whole group of tumors as we have been previously. And I haven't even mentioned yet the process of ethical oversight that goes along with clinical trials. The history of clinical trials ethics is long and sometimes unpleasant. And it's for sure, that's a whole topic on its own. So we're not going to talk about that today. Perhaps we could talk about that in a subsequent podcast. At any rate, that's a quick summary of clinical research or clinical trials for new drugs, particularly in cancer. If you have questions about that, as always, please leave them in the comments or ask me in some other fashion, and I'll be glad to try to address it. And as you can probably tell, I like to follow our more serious segments like we just talked about with something a little lighter and more fun. Today, I'd like to share some cool music I captured recently at Johnny B's Front Porch Bar in Lillian, Alabama, and that's just off the Gulf Coast. was fun. The name of the band is Spring Loaded, and they're fun guys. I enjoyed meeting them after the concert. In fact, they were so nice, they even invited the blues doctor to come back another time and sit in with them. So maybe we'll see that in the future. And that's about all we have for right now. There's no Tulane football game this week. The next game will be next Thursday, which is October the 9th, at home against East Carolina. So we'll be waiting for that. So, as I usually say at this time, please watch next week's podcast. Okay? See you later.